I've talked a lot about ancient Rome. I've talked about, the Roman Empire. I've talked about how the Roman Empire was based on the economic system of slavery. Slavery is a system where people own other people. And it's a pretty inefficient system, right? And the reason for it is simple. What motivation does a slave have to do any work? Not much. The master says, work harder or I will beat you, or work harder or I'll deprive you of food. But other than avoiding punishment, the slave really has no incentive to do anything. And the more slaves you get, the harder it is to keep making them work, right? And pretty soon you're going to have a slave who tells the other slave what to do. And then pretty soon you're going to have a slave who tells the slave what to do. It's a very, very inefficient way of doing things. And the Roman Empire, the bigger it got with its slave economic system, it became more and more inefficient. Their ability to grow crops vastly decreased. Their ability to produce goods and metal vastly decreased. Their ability to extract minerals from the ground, it vastly went down. The bigger the Roman Empire got, the more and more inefficient it became, because this system of slavery was outmoded. And there were a lot of countries that were popping up that had a more efficient system called feudalism. In feudalism, every peasant gets their little piece of land, and then they pay their obligation to the landlord, but then they get to keep what's left over. Far more efficient. They want to produce as much as they can so they can keep as much as they can. But the Romans, of course, were keeping their slave system, and the only way they could maintain it was going around to other peoples and other nations, plundering them and stealing what they had, and keeping it for themselves. And so they were a reactionary empire. They were holding back historical progress. They were keeping intact an economic order that was no longer progressive. They were holding back history. It was a pessimistic empire. And among the Romans, there were two trends of thinking. Most Romans were what you could call hedonists. And now a hedonist is somebody who, lives for pleasure. Most Romans, they would go to gladiatorial shows and bet, on the fighters. Most Romans would, they took pleasure in watching people being eaten by lions in the Colosseum. It was really common. They would have parties and stuff their faces full of food, and then they would have slaves with really long feathers to stuff them down their throats so they could vomit it all up and then go eat some more. This is at a time when most people around the world, were malnourished. So do you think people acting that way? That was most Romans. Most Romans were hedonists. But you got another trend of Romans they called the Stoicists. And the Stoicists did the opposite. The Stoicists, for example, they tended to starve themselves because they wanted to have less, and they wanted to have a spiritual experience by starving themselves. The Stoicists would take hallucinogenic drugs and mushrooms and try to space out. The Stoicists, they were famous for paying lots of money to see lectures by these philosophers who telling them that they should live less and have less. The Stoicists, they were known to whip and flog themselves. They were known to worship different gods from around the empire. And these were the two trends. You could be a hedonist, but if you were just smart enough to not just be purely living for pleasure, you could be a Stoicist. You could be a sadist or you could be a masochist. But it was all about destruction. And I've talked a lot about Michael Parenti's beautiful book about Julius Caesar and how Julius Caesar represented a completely different trend, the city-building tendency. Julius Caesar believed that the Roman Empire needed to completely adjust its relationship with history. He wanted to grant freedom to all kinds of different people that were enslaved. He wanted to give citizenship to people throughout the empire. I was reflecting on Julius Caesar and how he wanted to turn the various cities throughout the empire, like Alexandria and different capitals, in Gaul and elsewhere. He wanted to turn them into prosperous centers of trade. And I thought, it's funny. Julius Caesar was pretty much advocating a 73 BC version of the One Belt, One Road initiative. He was trying to transform the way the Roman Empire operated. He wanted the Roman Empire to be a force of progress around the world. He wanted to be lifting up people, empowering whole countries and nations, letting them be part, letting them have citizenship. He also wanted to empower the citizens within Rome. He was a champion of the proletarians. The proletarians, right? Who are the proletarians? Those are people that weren't slaves. They weren't owned by anybody else, but they didn't have any property. They had to rent where they lived. They were craftsmen. They sold their labor power. And Julius Caesar was loved by the proletarians. And Julius Caesar, of course, we know what happened. We learned about it from William Shakespeare. He was stabbed to death. And those greedy Roman senators who owned huge tracts of land, on some level, they probably knew that their empire needed to start changing the way it operated. But they were too greedy in the short term. They wanted so much in that moment. And they saw Julius Caesar, who was imposing taxes on them, who was talking about redistributing land. They saw him as a threat. So they stabbed to death the only person who could have saved their empire because they were in love with their own profit.